Hey, my name's Brent. Welcome back to the TPR 86cc build series. At the end of my last video, I ended up taking out my crankshaft bearings, the seals, as well as the Variator ramp plate, and then some other more minor damage. So in this video, I'm going to try to get the engine back together, but the main point here is going to be talking a little bit about that failure and hopefully making a part that will prevent that in the future, or at least make it much less likely. First thing I want to do is show you that I've got a brand new crankshaft sitting here, and I want to say thank you to scootertuning.ca. As you've seen in many of my other videos, they help support this series and my channel in general by giving me a bit of a discount, and I am greatly appreciative of that. If you enjoy the videos and such and appreciate their support as well, then please go check those guys out. They have a lot of scooter parts from stock to tuning, high-end racing, whatever you need. So definitely go take a look around there. So this is the same crank that I was using, top performance 86cc crank. It's got a 44mm stroke, 85mm connecting rod, and it's for a 12mm wrist pin. So it's made for the top performance 86cc kit. Some people have questioned the crankshaft. I don't believe it's the point of failure. I had checked it before I ever put it in the engine, and it ran quite true, and I never had any trouble until that failure. I believe that it was either the bearings or the Variator ramp plate that failed and caused the crankshaft to get a little bit out of whack as an effect rather than the cause. So anyway, this includes the seals as well as bearings. So I didn't have to buy anything else for that. The bearings have been a bit of a point of contention here because these are SKF TN9 C3 6204 bearings. And the reason that some people are questioning them is because of what you can see right here. This is one of the bearings supplied with a top performance crankshaft and the same style of bearing that I was using when I had my failure. So it is a TN9 version of the 6204 bearing. This is a more standard version of a 6204 bearing. Both of these are made by SKF, same manufacturer. And you can clearly see there's a difference there. So this is what most of us are used to seeing when we look at these roller ball bearings. And you can see that it's got a steel cage around the bearings, and you can actually see it on both sides. Doesn't matter which side, it's there. On this model, it uses a polymer, polyamide 66 material, basically a plastic, as the cage. And you can see there's a lot of structure here on this side, and then if I flip it over, they're much more open on that side. So I think the major question is not so much with the structure itself, but whether or not that polymer or plastic is suitable for bearings in an engine like this. Well, first off, I'll say that Top Performance supplied them, and some people really seem to say that they are not a very good manufacturer. However, I would trust them enough to say they definitely would not supply you with a set of bearings that was not suitable for what their kit was intended for. There's not really a whole lot of price difference, so there'd be no real benefit there that I can tell. I believe probably the reason that they were selected, and before I get into this, let me say I am not a bearing expert, make no claims of being a bearing expert, but I'm thinking the reason that they really supplied these is largely because you may get an advantage in friction with these polymer cages. So they actually have less friction, and if you're going to turn something up to say 12, 13, 14,000 RPM, friction can be a pretty large loss. So if nothing else for a manufacturer, I would think it'd probably be a good thing, especially if you had someone perhaps do a dyno test or any sort of performance tests. It would be a good thing to reduce friction with bearings like that, especially again without a huge cost difference in the two, because it would make your kit look better overall. I don't know how much difference that really equates to. I have a feeling it's fairly minimal, but still it would be an advantage. Could also change lubrication properties because of having the balls there so open on one side. But the real question is if they are strong enough because it's plastic. I'm pretty sure the steel has the advantage in strength. Again, I don't know. I haven't stress tested all these. These are actually this is the first real large bearing failure that I've ever had. I've had bearings kind of go bad. They feel a little rough, but this is the first time I've had one actually come apart and blow the cage apart. So I don't have enough experience to tell you for certain that the steel is stronger, but my opinion would be that probably the steel is the stronger bearing, and the C3 or the TN9 bearing here is going to be the slightly advantageous for horsepower style of bearing. To help you understand a little bit more about why I'm not afraid to use these bearings again, this is what happened 10 miles before the engine failure where my crank and bearings and ramp plate went. So this cylinder was on the engine, and you can see here very clearly that there is coating, the cylinder plating is missing here in a couple of spots. And that is a Nicosil silicon carbide style of plating. It's very, very hard, and it went somewhere through the engine. I never found it in the engine, so it passed through the engine at some point. Now, it could have got down there in the bearings, and that very hard material could have even done damage to the bearings. So that may potentially be at least part of the cause, and it may have nothing to do with it. This is the ramp plate that was part of the failure, and you can see here a very large crack going all the way through the ramp plate, and even two other stress cracks there forming but not making it all the way through to the other side. So let me show you the video of the failure again and just take a look at what happened. After my engine failure occurred, I really thought that the ramp plate was a secondary thing. It was kind of collateral damage, that the bearing must have failed, and it in turn took out the crankshaft, got that a bit out of true, and then took out the ramp plate as well with all of the motion that was allowed, the amount of wobble that could be in the crankshaft, basically everything getting out of balance. I just thought it probably overstressed the ramp plate at that point and cracked it. But then I posted the video about all of this, my previous video, and it was brought to my attention by a few people in the comments. So apparently this is not an unforeseen failure. It's something that happens much more commonly than I was aware of in high RPM engines especially, and I guess also especially with overrange kits. So that got me thinking about it a little bit. And when I watched the video of the failure and remembering the failure, knowing how it happened and what I could hear better in person, I never experienced any issues, any symptoms at all. It was running great. And then all of a sudden, right at the same time that you can see the Variator start to wobble in the video, that's when everything kind of fell apart and I clearly had an issue. So it could be that everything was so quick that it was almost simultaneously that the bearings, or the bearing especially on the Variator side, and the crankshaft and the ramp plate all got out of whack and they all failed so quickly that you just can't tell the difference. I do think they all happened in a very close succession, but most likely one of them was to blame for it. I don't exactly know how you would determine which one was the culprit, but it sounds like, again, that this is a much more common failure than I was aware of, so it is a good possibility that the ramp plate caused all of this. Thankfully, some of the people that pointed out the problem to me also pointed out that there is a fairly simple solution, or at least something that makes it less likely to reoccur, and that is using a spacer behind the ramp plate that has a larger diameter than standard spacers. This is the standard spacer supplied by Malossi with the overrange kit. The only difference in this one is that I have shaved it down a little bit just to meet my needs, because I really need to get the Variator ramp plate up against this boss here on the crankshaft fairly tight as I can without running into the starter boss that's on the cases. So I'd shave just a little bit off of that. And obviously it just slides into place there. And then when you put your Variator assembly, the ramp plate on, the ramp plate will sit up against that spacer. The suggested solution is basically to switch from a very small contact patch like this to a spacer that would have a large contact patch. I'm just going to use this washer as an example. So if you look at the difference between those, you would have all of this area transferring force instead of just this tiny amount of area here. So it should better support the ramp plate, and hopefully the ramp plate doesn't crack again in the future. I thought about this a little bit, and it started to make a whole lot of sense to me why this would be a common problem, especially with overrange kits. So when you install an overrange variator, most of them are so large that you can no longer use the electric start system on these Minarelli scooters or the Minarelli clones like I have. And what that means is part of the electric start system is this starter clutch. And this sits right behind the Variator ramp plate. So sitting behind your Variator ramp plate, you have a nice thick chunk of steel here, and that can support the entire flat surface of the ramp plate there. So it is well supported. Then you get the overrange kit, you take this out, and you put in this tiny little support here, the spacer, to replace all of that. So that would make a whole lot of sense why it would be a major stress point that you didn't have before. Plus, there's the factor that when you install an overrange kit, most likely you're not doing it to a stock engine or a very mild engine. They are usually put on high rev, high horsepower applications, so much more stress. It was also pointed out to me on the forum that a spacer as described is included with Stage 6's overrange kit. So I looked that up and I saw that indeed they do show a spacer in there with a larger diameter to support the ramp plate, or at least I'm assuming to support the ramp plate at this point. And I actually saw that they sell that separately, and it has a part number that I'll put up here. So after I had seen that, I went ahead and researched a bit further, and I looked it up to see if Stage 6 included any sort of instructions with their overrange kit, and indeed they did. So when I looked through, I found this section that I'll put on your screen, and let me just read it to you, and you can read along. Here it is crucial to mount the spacer exactly as shown to strengthen the back of the ramp plate and ensure that the force can be transferred more effectively to the supporting seat of the crankshaft. So Stage 6 is right here saying what people have told me in comments, that apparently this is a common failure, it's something known to happen, or they wouldn't have bothered to do this, and this is their solution. After looking at the ramp plate as well as this section of the crankcase, I think if I had a spacer that was maybe a maximum of 1.5 inches outside diameter, it could support the majority of the rear section of this ramp plate. And the reason that I say 1.5 inches maximum for that, which by the way is about 38 millimeters, is because the spacer will have to go through this section here a bit, and that would provide a bit of clearance between the spacer and this section of the crankcase, because I'm not 100% sure exactly how true this area is, and you wouldn't want any kind of contact between the spacer and the case there. I ended up making it a little bit different than the other options that I've shown or that I've seen. And I ended up making it kind of a thick flat section here, and then just gradually tapering into the section that matches up with the shoulder on the crank. So it's probably a little more mass or weight than I would have to have on the crankshaft, but it looks pretty sturdy to me. And I made it the same thickness as this spacer. This was the Malossi overrange spacer that I cut down to suit my needs. So this thing measured out to, I believe it was 325, yeah, 325 thousandths. And I cut this one to the same 325 thousandths. Let me show you how much difference there is in the contact there. So there is the Malossi spacer. And now, here's the spacer that I just made. Pretty big difference. It looks like this spacer should work well. I've got enough room around here that if it's running into those walls of the case, then I've got bigger issues. And the spacing seems to be fine, which is what I'd expect since I cut it to match the other spacer. But it looks like I've got enough room between the ramp plate and everything else that it won't be an issue. I'm going to wrap this video up here. Obviously the engine's not totally back together, but I will get it the rest of the way back together. The main point of this video was just to let you know that I am making some progress on the engine, and especially to share the information about the ramp plate spacer. And I greatly appreciate the people that commented and let me know about that. That's one of those things that I really haven't seen mentioned before, but apparently it's somewhat common knowledge among people that are more used to high-end stuff, so greatly appreciate the heads up. As always, thank you for watching. Make sure you subscribe to see what else is coming up in the 86cc build series, and be sure to like this video if you enjoyed it or found it helpful. Thanks again.